Okay, I got cut off in the middle of my example there, but I don't think I need to go any further for you to get the idea. Unfortunately, we've all known people who've struggled with addictions, at least most of us, and we probably all know how difficult it can be to try to help those folks, especially when they tell us that they don't want help, especially when they keep relapsing over and over and over again and don't seem to be taking responsibility for their actions. There tends to come a time when people who love those who are struggling with addiction have to have some boundaries and say, you know what, I can't keep doing this forever. That actually the actions that are trying to help are enabling that person to continue in their destructive behavior. And so oftentimes those people will be cut off through divorce, through other means of distancing, abandonment, which is the word that we just looked at in Scripture. And so in this particular example that Boyd gives, it had a tragic end. The man who was addicted got on the highway while he was drunk, going the wrong direction, ended up not surviving. The worst part was that then at the funeral, the wife, who's now a widow, is there with her kids, and the father, her father-in-law, the father of the man who had died, he comes up to her and he says, you know what, this is your fault. If you hadn't abandoned him, if you hadn't divorced him, this never would have happened. It's a sad and disturbing example of the ways that sometimes we blame one another for things that are not their fault. Now, Boyd uses this as an example of what sometimes happens, he sees happening in the Old Testament, and again, I agree with him. You don't have to agree with us. The idea is that God, rather than punishing people or rather than enabling people as they continue in their sin, in their violence, and their injustice, God simply abandons them, as Paul says, to the desires of their hearts. Because God knows that evil has a way of self-destructing over time. That people who pursue the wrong path, the way of the wicked, as it's written about in the Psalms, those people don't get very far because they have a way of self-destructing. Another way that this is talked about is that God is handing them over to powers of evil, to powers of darkness, which is not to say it's less of an active thing as it is more of a releasing, a saying, you know what, I can't protect you anymore if this is the way you're going to be as a people, says God in the Old Testament. But what then happens is that when those people persist in their sin and they do encounter some kind of calamity as a result of their actions, then other people blame God because they say, well, God, if you had protected those people, then they wouldn't have died, or they wouldn't have been carted off to Babylon, or they wouldn't have faced that flood. And so God ends up taking the blame for something that isn't really God's fault. And that's, I see this pattern happening in the Old Testament over and over and over again. And yet, even in the Old Testament, we see echoes of those voices who blame God. In Lamentations, in Jeremiah, there was a tendency to assume that God was all-powerful and to not understand why it is that God would let people persist in sin rather than intervening through some form of violence or coercion. So last scripture for today, for this week, I want to look at is one from the Old Testament. This is Exodus chapter 12. And I want to use this as an example of how God uses other elements to, and then is implicated in their violence. So I wrote on the board here, hopefully you can read that. Right, one way of thinking about it is that God lets evildoers face natural consequences for their action. Another way that Scripture portrays it is handing those people over to Satan or the powers of evil. There's many ways of describing this, and I'll hopefully get into this a little bit more next week or the week after. Satan goes by many names in the Old Testament. the accuser, the evil one, the destroyer is one of them. So, Exodus 12, this is the story of the Passover, which also happens to be central to the Passion narrative. The Last Supper, if you recall, was Jesus having dinner with his disciples, remembering this story. So it's very much central to what it is that he's doing on the cross. This is Exodus chapter 12. I'm beginning at verse 23. It's talking about how, if you'll recall, the people of God were slaves in Egypt for about 400 years. Then God called Moses to deliver them. God sent Moses to Pharaoh, and there were a bunch of plagues that tried to convince Pharaoh to let the people go, but none of them were working. This is the last plague. This is God saying, okay, this is what's necessary to get Pharaoh to change Pharaoh's mind. So verse 23, when the Lord comes by to strike down the Egyptians and sees the blood on the beam above the door and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over that door. That's why it's called Passover. So God had determined that the firstborn of the Egyptians would all die. That's talking about children, animals, all of them. The firstborn of every household, even Pharaoh's own child, would die. And if you think about that on the surface, it's horrific. This is God engaging in infanticide, of God doing the kind of thing that that only the evil king Herod was doing in the New Testament, right? Killing all the babies in order to try to target Jesus. Why would God do this? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. If God is all loving, if God is merciful and compassionate as we see in Jesus, how could God strike down the firstborn of God's enemies? But this sentence here that I started with talks about how the Lord was passing over the houses of the Israelites. And so part of what I see going on in this story, kind of the big picture of it, is that God is siding on is choosing to side with the less powerful people. That the reason God is intervening in this particular scenario to begin with is in order to set oppressed people go. And and already God has allowed 9 other pestilences to come through this land in order to convince the Egyptians to let go of their slaves, but they weren't listening. And so another way of looking at this story is that God then abandoned the Egyptians to the point where some kind of plague came upon their land. And then God chose to deliver the Hebrew people from that plague by marking their doors with some blood from a sacrificial animal. Again, it's all about emphasis. It's about how you choose to look at the story. He won't let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you down. There's that word, the destroyer. Sometimes the narrator in these Old Testament stories attributes everything to God, and then in the very next breath brings in another element. The destroyer is not God. The destroyer in the Old Testament is some agent of evil, be that Satan, be that one of the natural deities of the world that were believed to exist at the time. There's a sense in which God has abandoned this nation, Egypt, and allowed the destroyer to come in and do its worst. But that God has chosen to deliver the Hebrew people from this destroyer who is now entering houses to strike people down. And then God gives them a ritual to observe, to remember this event, how God had saved the people from this destroyer who is coming in. You shall observe this ritual as a regulation for all time, for you and your children. When you enter the land that the Lord has promised to give you, be sure that you observe this ritual. That's what Jesus is doing at the Last Supper. And when your children ask you, what does this ritual mean to you? You will say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord. For the Lord passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. When he struck down the Egyptians, he spared our houses. What I see when I read this is God telling the Hebrew people to remember the reason for this. The reason for this ritual is to remind you that God delivered you. It's not to remind you or to tell you somehow that the Lord is bloodthirsty or violent. It's that God delivers you not only from slavery, but from a pestilence, from a deadly disease or some kind of evil destroyer who came through and massacred children. They were saved. That was meant to be the moral of the story. But the narrator goes back and forth between calling it the destroyer and saying that it was the Lord. When the Lord, or he, we assume that's the Lord, struck down the Egyptians, he, the Lord, spared our houses. As I mentioned last week or the week before, it was customary in ancient Near Eastern cultures to attribute all victories to God. Even if that victory was bloodthirsty, sometimes that was considered a good thing because it meant your God was great. And so you see the limited understanding of early Israelite people in not being quite sure what happened, but thinking that clearly God prevailed, therefore God must have done the slaughtering. The people then bowed down and worshiped. The Israelites went and did exactly what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron to do. And so even to the time of Jesus, we have Jesus celebrating this Passover, and yet this time saying, appropriating that story, appropriating their limited understanding, and saying, you know what, now I will be the Passover lamb. Jesus says, I will be the one whose blood will be put on the doorposts. I will be the one who will save you from the destroyer. I will be the one who gives you victory over death. That by my sacrifice, you will be saved. That's the Christus Victor theory of atonement. Right? It's not saying that humanity in general is like the Egyptians and that we need to be slaughtered like the firstborn. It's actually saying Jesus will be the firstborn. Jesus will take on the sin even if it's there. Even if we want to believe in the wrath of God, even then God will take that on because that's how God accommodates our limited understanding of grace. And that all these perspectives are part of what makes this the central narrative of our faith. The way that God delivers us from natural consequences, from Satan, from the destroyer, even from wrath, if that's the way that we want to look at it. That God delivers us through the cross. And that the way that Boyd talks about it is that some of these stories in the Old Testament, they serve as literary crucifixes. That on the surface, they look violent and ugly and disturbing. And yet behind the scenes, if you can see it through the lens of Christ, through the lens of love, of faith, we see that something else is going on. And that it is possible that God was simply accommodating people's limited understanding of what was happening at the time. Anyway, that's plenty from me today. Thank you again for tuning in. I look forward to discussing some of these things with you. I'll try to come up with some discussion questions so that there'll be some kind of feedback. If nothing else, please just tell me what comes to mind when you read these stories. I'd love to know how you react to words like Satan or when you think about natural consequences. The last thing I almost forgot to mention is that we happen to be in the midst of a pestilence right now. We happen to be dealing with a pandemic that we haven't seen in at least 100 years. And I know a lot of people are wondering, is this because we have sinned? Is this because God is punishing us? Is this because God has abandoned us to our sinful condition, the lusts of our hearts? And so I wanted to respond to that, even though it's not really part of what I wanted to talk about today. Just in that, and I'll give you Greg Boyd's explanation for this, which I totally agree with. When we read Scripture, you have to keep in mind there's more than 2,000 years of history there, and we only see God intervening in fits and starts. And even then, it's usually only in retrospect that people say, oh, God was at work. Or it's when there's a particularly powerful prophet who comes along who speaks for God. That is not happening today. Or at least, if it is, we probably won't know for hundreds of years. It won't be until we look back and say, oh, that's what God was doing. Anyone today who claims to understand why it is that COVID-19 is killing people is claiming the same authority as Scripture. We'll talk about this more in person.